Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, Henri Bergson, duration is what we're into today. Before I do actually, I did say at the beginning, I think 2 videos ago, this series, I'm not going to kind of work my way through any one book in particular. I'm certainly not doing like a chapter by chapter breakdown, but I am just basically following Bergson's thought through time and free will, and then we're going to look through matter and memory, and then finally we'll go through creative evolution. So I'm really following Bergson's timeline anyway, but it's not a kind of, I mean, if you're thinking of reading along, or if you're trying to kind of anchor these videos in something, I am really following those books, although very much unlike Heidegger and Sartre and co, I'm not doing a kind of chapter by chapter breakdown. I'm more focused on the bigger ideas, I think. Anyway, that's just kind of a side note. So we're looking through time and free will, and we're going to be looking at duration today, and we'll start with space. So space, we're just kind of flesh this idea out at the beginning here, because it's going to be something we will contrast to duration. So there are 2 kinds of space that Bergson is interested in. The first he calls the perception of extensity. And this is basically an original lived spatiality, which is experienced as being full of qualitative differences. Bergson calls that heterogeneous. An important word for Bergson, it comes up again and again, and it comes up in distinction, in contrast to homogeneous. So those words are good to kind of become familiar with. So this kind of, this sense of space is something that we live. It's not something that we abstract. It's not something that we conceptualize. It's our lived way of being in a space with other things, being anchoring ourselves, orienting ourselves in our environment. So it's a lived spatiality, and it has these qualitative differences. And you can think about this, perhaps an easy way to think about it is the difference between right and left. If one hand is dominant, so I'm right-handed, the right hand feels different to me from the left. Things on my right side feel different from the left. It's not just the two aren't equal. The two aren't I can't do what I can do with my right with my left as equally as well. If I go to throw a ball, it feels natural if I do it with my right. The left side, it's kind of strange. So, and that carries over into the way that I kind of subtly perceive my orientation in the world, in relation to other things. The right side just feels a little bit different from the left. I don't know my right as being different from my left through kind of thinking about it. It's a natural, lived difference. And that's just a small example of these qualitative differences that a lived spatiality has. The heterogeneity of a lived spatiality. Obviously, Merleau-Ponty picks up on this and talks about this as well in Phenomenology of Perception. He talked about this in a number of different senses. One was with tribes people, kind of what he calls primitive tribes people, who, when they think about the location of their clan encampment, it's associated with this feeling of a kind of a peaceful feeling. It's not just another point on the map. It has an affective quality to it. And you could say the same thing about many religious believers today, right? The church has a different feel where the church is. It's not just another building. It has some special kind of feeling associated with it, an affective quality. Mecca is a great example, right? So important that Muslims have to orient themselves in the world in relation to it, right? They have to direct themselves to it to go through the praying, the ritual, the prayer ritual that they do. So again, location. It's not just a compass point. It's there's a feeling associated with it, and so that's apparent in many different ways in everyday life. The example that Bergson gives, which is a good one, is animals are navigating through, however they do it, whether it's magnetic fields or whatever it is. The directions aren't the same for them. That one direction has kind of a privilege over others, depending on what they're doing. So if they're trying to get back home, many animals are able to navigate, follow a straight line, basically back to their home. And however it is that they're able to do that, that line back to their home is obviously, it has a different feeling from other directions. And so that's this lived spatiality. The other kind of space, Bergson calls a conception of space. And so this is space which we're conceiving of it as a homogeneous medium, which makes abstract, objectifying thought possible because it gives us a background on which to juxtapose things to each other. We talked about this a little bit in the last video with psychic states. They're intensive, they're intensities, but we tend to spatialize them, and it means that we end up thinking these psychic states are measurable, that they're quantitative, when in fact they're qualitative and intensities rather than this kind of something that can be analyzed and measured and quantified. Conception of space, it's an abstract, homogeneous background. So every point in this abstract manifold that we're imagining when we think of space in this way is the same. No point is privileged. No point is special. Every point is just another point with a coordinate, with a set of coordinates which directs us to that, which individuates that point amongst the others. But there's nothing special. There's nothing else special about it. It's just like the same as every other point on the plane, whatever it is that we're thinking of. So that this kind of space, it's an abstract way of thinking about something. It's not a real space. This conception of space doesn't exist anywhere. It's an abstract tool that we invoke whenever we want to objectify, whenever we want to analyze something. So it's no longer within the world. It's not a part of the lived world. I've written it's not contaminated with our qualitative feelings. It's this kind of pristine, idealized model. And this kind of space is only available for highly intelligent animals or animals capable of higher kind of cognitive functioning. And so it's connected with the intellect. And that's a nice contrast with what we said before. Space has perception of extensity. All animals have this. You don't need any special kind of cognitive abilities. It's present for all animals. This one, however, this abstract conception of space is only available for animals with a higher degree of intellect. So with that in mind, let's turn to duration. Okay, duration. So, first of all, perhaps why the word duration? Why did Bergson shy away from the word time? The reason is basically because, well, actually, let me just get into it, and then I think it'll be clear. So when we think of time, we usually think of time as a dimension, right? Another dimension like space. So it's a static, background, homogeneous medium in which events unfold. It's like a container through which we're moving. When we think of space in the same way, this kind of background which plays no active role in what we do. It's just this. Each point is the same as any other point. No points are privileged. No moments are privileged. That's a fundamental idea in science, right? That's what it is to be objective. But when we think of time like this, we think of it as this kind of background medium in which things happen. Then it actually means that all of those individual moments in time coexist, right? We're kind of, it's like a timeline, right? You've got the past here, the present here, and the future there. All of those moments we can see before us at once. So all of those moments coexist, which means there's no actual duration. Nothing is actually enduring through time. And if that's the case, then there's no time, because that's fundamentally what time is. It's that enduring, that sense of persisting through, that sense of living. If you get rid of that, if you replace it with this abstract idea of time as a timeline, or time as a dimension similar to space, then we can easily throw up every moment on this ruler, and all moments coexist. We're no longer engaged. We're looking from the outside as a spectator. And if we have that situation, there's no sense in which time is happening. Time is not flowing at all. And if time's not flowing, it's not time, it's space. And so that's the way that we normally think of time, as the static background, which we can project in front of us, the past, the present, and the future. And if we have that idea, what we've done is spatialized time. And it's the same as we talked about just before, space. Perception of extensity and the conception of space, where you've got duration, which is lived. It's along with that perception of extensity. It's qualitative. It's engaged. It's something that is experienced, right? As opposed to over here, the conception of space and the conception of time, the scientific, and the normal, the typical understanding that we have of time is just another dimension. It's something that is. It's an abstract, idealized conception. It's not what we fundamentally live. And if it's not what we fundamentally live, it can't be metaphysically true, right? So we're living in reality. If our description of reality doesn't match what we're living, then we've got a problem. But that's what we have. We kind of have that situation now. We've got this pristine, idealized scientific account, which, again, I'm not criticizing science at all, but it's not describing fundamental reality. It can't be, because it's excluding. That's a reality that no one lives. No one can live in that reality. It's an idealized conception. It's an abstract model, but it's not what we actually live. And so these ideas, you get space and time, they don't map on to what we actually experience. And there's that divide. And it's kind of, I think it's come to the fore with consciousness, because there's just no way to bridge that gap. And so we're talking about pie in the sky notions like emergence, which doesn't mean anything, doesn't explain anything, or integrated information, which again, I can't see it going anywhere, because it's just ignoring the fundamental divide that's there. We're trying to bridge something which is fundamentally lived, fundamentally experienced, with a static, abstract model. And I don't think it's going to work. There has to be a complete reevaluation of the situation. Anyway, I've drifted. So time without this sense of duration, time without this sense of persisting or enduring, is actually space. Which brings us to duration itself. And let me give you a quote. Pure duration is the form which the succession of our conscious states assumes when our ego lets itself live, when it refrains from separating its present states from its former states. Okay, so there are a couple of important things in that quote. It's interesting, actually. Bergson's not defining duration. He's talking about duration. He's talking about our conscious states, actually, our psychic states, and the way that our psychic states succeed one another. There's a flow with our psychic states. That is a kind of duration. That's the form of duration that our psychic states go through. So succession is key. Succession is important in duration. There has to be this progression. There has to be a flow, a flux, a change from one state to another. If you don't have that, pretty much obviously, right, you don't have duration. You don't have time. You've got space masquerading as time. So succession's important. There has to be a succession. We saw this in the end of the last video as well, with the bell, the ringing of the bell. Each bell, each peal sounds one after the other. So there's succession there. And that's a form of duration. And not just succession, though. You have the succession, but where we don't lock ourselves into the present and separate the present from other states. So duration is this succession, but it's also this kind of a wider, broader intuit. No, that's not a good word. A broader sense of an awareness of prior states and perhaps future states to come. So it's not locked into this present moment. Again, typically how we think of time, right? We think of time, we're locked into this present. We're always in the present. It's never the past or the future. Past is just a memory. The future is just expectation. The only thing that's real is the present. But that's an idealized conception of time, right? No one lives that. No one lives locked in the present moment. We're always, our present is always informed by the past. It's always, our past moments always carry through. They bleed into the present. If they didn't, we wouldn't be able to live. We wouldn't be able to function. And these, as they bleed into the present, we're the way I described it before is I'm leaning into the future at the same time. So I'm not locked into this single moment. I'm a broader temporal existence, let's say. So we refrain from just separating ourselves in this, locking ourselves into this present, separating ourselves from other moments, other states. And that goes against kind of the normal everyday sense of time, but also things like Buddhism, which focuses on the present. There are elements of Buddhism, I think. In fact, a lot of Buddhism is very complementary to science and it overlaps with science in a number of places, which is why it has a lot of respect, I think, in the West. But again, here, the Buddhist idea, the present is the only thing real. You only ever live in the present. It's just not true. We don't live in the present. We're not locked into the present. We are a broader temporal. We have a broader temporal existence than that. But having said that, so we span this wider temporal field, but we're not explicitly positing each of these states, right? So there's only one state present before us at once. That's what it means. That's what a succession is, right? If you have more than one state before you at one time, it's not a succession anymore. Then it's space. You've just thrown everything up against the wall and you can see it all clearly laid out before you. But there's no enduring there, right? So enduring, there's a succession. There's only ever one state before you, but there's an awareness of these other states that have gone before and these other states that are coming. But it's kind of, well, to go with Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, it's non-thetic. It's not explicit. We're not explicitly juxtaposing these states. We're not putting them up one by one, in front of us. We're not laying them out, which would be to spatialize time, which would be to lose what we're trying to look at, which is duration, which is time. Rather, instead of juxtaposing them like that, we have this kind of awareness, this non-thetic awareness of them, other states. And the way that Bergson describes this, he doesn't use the word non-thetic. That's I don't know where that came from. I first heard it in Sartre. I'm not sure he coined it, though. But both Sartre and Merleau-Ponty use it. But Bergson talks about the past and the present coming together into an organic whole, in which the past is gathered up without being explicitly posited. So we've got this organic whole, which means that we're not looking at individual moments, individual states or individual elements in the succession, but they're all there in the present moment. So when I'm listening now, I'm only hearing the single peal of the bell, the single ring of the bell, but that ring, it contains all of the rings that came before it. They're all interconnected in this organic whole. And that is how that's how Bergson's going to describe it in this next quote I have, which is a better, I think, definition of duration itself. So anyway, he says duration is a succession without distinction, a mutual penetration, an interconnection and organization of elements, each one of which represents the whole and cannot be distinguished or isolated from it except by abstract thought. And that is exactly what I was just getting at. The succession, but a succession without distinction. There's only ever one moment present, but that moment it's interpenetrated, it's interconnected with all the other moments. We see the whole thing together. We get this picture of an organic whole. And we can't break it apart without going into abstract territory, without losing what it is that we're focusing on here, that we're interested in. Duration, the psychic states, how they're how they appear for us. As soon as we break them down by state by state, then we're juxtaposing them, we're abstracting them, we're spatializing them, and that's again something that I remember saying those exact words in the videos on Merleau-Ponty somewhere. As soon as we abstract, as soon as we break something apart, we've lost what it is we're looking for. We start looking at a reflective representation of the thing, an idea of the thing rather than the thing itself. So anyway, what I wanted to focus on or emphasize in that quote, duration's not just succession, but it's that mutual penetration of elements, of states. And just an interesting kind of side note is I feel that description, that process, the succession, which is the succession of states which are interconnected, the way that Bergson's talking about, I think that is what consciousness is. It's what kind of makes consciousness conscious, if you like. And I'm working on a series of articles at the moment, which I'm trying to kind of disentangle the mess that is consciousness at the moment, and I'm doing it through Bergson, through this idea of duration, and I think it's really interesting. I think this is very. It's just everything just comes together so nicely in Bergson in a way that I haven't seen before. You get this from a phenomenological perspective in Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, although maybe a little bit less with Sartre actually. But here this is pure metaphysics now. So he's really looking at describing what reality is, not just reality from our phenomenological perspective, but reality itself. So yeah, it's all good. This is great stuff. Okay, let me keep going. So psychic states originally endure, or they succeed one another, interpenetrating each other in this way that makes an organic whole. But when we think about them, we necessarily conceive of them as coexisting simultaneously in a certain order. And when this happens, we have spatialized duration. So what's important in there is that we necessarily conceive of them in this way. And this makes kind of duration a little bit tricky to touch, if you like, to grab, because when we use the only tool we have for thinking, which is our minds, we automatically go spatial. We automatically think in terms of space. That's just the way our brains work, or our minds work. And so it's the only way we can think about things is through this spatial approach, this analytic, abstract approach. If we didn't do that, we wouldn't be able to think. Right? We'd be like the animals, just we'd be navigating through space in that perception of extensity, through space as a perception of extensity, but we wouldn't have the capacity for abstract thought. We wouldn't be able to think about what it is that we're doing, and that's our gift, but it's also our curse, because when we do that, when we're thinking about something like duration, to think about it in the first place, to intellectualize about it, to abstract, that in itself negates duration. That act negates duration. So the act of thinking about it dissipates the thing we're trying to think about, which makes it kind of a tricky thing to get your head around. And you kind of have to approach it obliquely. You have to look at it kind of from the corner of your eye, because if you look at it directly, it disappears. If you try and think about it kind of the way that we normally think about it, and there's no other way to think. That's the trick here. There's no other way. There's no special way of thinking. There's only one way of thinking, and that's a spatial way. It's a logical way. It's kind of like, and I really think there's this is the Taoism, the Tao that what is it? The Tao that can be spoken of is not the real Tao, something like that. But that applies so well here. Duration that you can speak about, that you can think about, is not the real duration. That duration is something that can only be lived. It only works in a life, in a lived situation. Abstracting it out from that situation immediately loses what is essential, what's intrinsic to duration. And I just want to go through another example that Bergson gives here. He talks about a pendulum swinging backwards and forwards. And imagining, keeping that in your mind, he says, I shall perceive one in the other, each permeating the other and organizing themselves like the notes of a tune, so as to form what we shall call a continuous or qualitative multiplicity with no resemblance to number. I shall thus get the image of pure duration, but I shall have entirely got rid of the idea of a homogeneous medium or a measurable quantity. Okay, cool. So a pendulum swinging backwards and forwards. When I think of it, when I perceive it, when I live it, each of those swings permeates every other swing. There is no isolated single swing. Each swing is part of a greater whole, like the notes of a tune. And that's probably the best example. It's funny he didn't use that example. Husserl used it and really, really hammered it out, I think, nicely with the melody. A melody doesn't make any sense unless you've got a broader focus, unless, if you're locked into the present note, then there is no melody there, right? There's no melody in the individual notes. The melody comes from the notes flowing, each note being interconnected with the note that came before it and that is coming after it. And we're kind of, the melody leads us somewhere, even as it came from somewhere. And we're aware of that. That's what it is. That's what duration is. That's what it is to live your time, not just to abstract it out there, not just to spatialize it. And that Bergson calls, I almost called him Merleau-Ponty. I did that in the last video too. That Bergson calls a qualitative multiplicity. So it's a multiplicity because you've got a succession, right? The pendulum swinging 10 times, 15 times, but it's qualitative in the sense that we're aware of it. We've got this broader sense of the present swing in a broader, in a greater whole. And that's what duration is. Same idea as the bell ringing. Important pure duration cannot be measured because it's not a quantity. Exactly the same as we saw with intensities of psychic states. They can't be measured because they are purely qualitative. We think they can be measured. We think we can count them and treat them like number, like objective, quantitative data, but that's only because we've spatialized them already. Once we've spatialized them, we can go ahead and measure and count and do all of those wonderful things with it, put them into equations, but as the experiences that they actually are, they're qualitative. They're not quantitative. So I like that term, qualitative multiplicity. It's the multiplicity we talked about at the end of the last video. It's the second kind. I didn't use the word qualitative multiplicity. I think I just called it the multiplicity of psychic states, but that's what it is. Interesting point, which we're not going to drill into here, but we will come back to, is so we've got this idea, duration, succession of psychic states that all interpenetrate each other, but how do they melt into each other like this? How is that affected? That's a good question, and Bergson answers it by saying memory with the capacity, memory. So memory is, I think of memory as the engine of duration, the driver. It's what allows those states, those separate states, to interpenetrate like this, to connect together into a whole. And we're gonna spend a little bit of time on memory a little bit later, but that's coming anyway. So just be aware of that. I'll give you a couple more definitions, I think, just because they're nice. Bergson talks about these quite nicely. Duration, he talks about it as a synthesis of the past and the present with a view to the future. Again, that idea, there's a connection, there's a past and the present, these states are blended together in some way into a whole, and with a view to the future. And it's there in Bergson, but it's very much understated. He doesn't pay much attention to the future, which is interesting because Heidegger's the exact opposite, right? For Heidegger, the future is the main ecstasy. The other ones, past and the present, they're important. Obviously, they're all intertwined, but for Heidegger, it's the future that's the key. For Bergson, very much it's the past. And we'll see this when we talk about memory a little bit more as well. But it's just an interesting thing to think about. One last definition, and this is from Creative Evolution. Duration is the continuous progress of the past which gnaws into the future and which swells as it advances. Just a nice description. Eh? I mean, these people, all of these philosophers, they have these... The philosophers that we've been reading, they all have this real knack with words, and that's a nice description. Continuous progress of the past, gnawing into the future, swelling as it advances. Beautiful. One consequence of this, and this is going to lead us into the last section of this video, is that it means change is constant. Duration is the continuous progress of the past. So one thing that is underlying this is the idea of change, becoming, and creation. And Bergson talks more about this in Creative Evolution, but what I want to say about this is quite small, and it ties in nicely with duration, so we'll look at that now. Right, basically, change, creation, and becoming, essentially these are all three facets of the same thing. Three kind of, and that thing is duration. So it's underlying, duration's underlying these three notions. And that's the way I've described them here, as kind of consequences of Bergson's idea of duration. So let's have a look at some things. There are a few things I wanted to say here. The first is that change obviously occurs in between psychic states. So we're kind of restricting our discussion here of duration to psychic states for now. So change occurs obviously in between each psychic state. So the succession of psychic states, there's a change in between them. But change also is taking place in each state itself. So whatever it is that's succeeding, whatever elements are succeeding each other, in addition to the change in between each element, there's also a change within each element. Every state is itself constantly changing, because just to exist is to change. And that means, and that's again just a consequence of the fact that every state is enduring, fundamentally enduring. So not only is there change in between states, but the states themselves are constantly changing. They are constant change. And that, I mean, I've already said it, it's a key element, but this idea of continuity in Bergson, becoming. There is no, nothing is static in Bergson. Everything, reality, psychic states, even the natural world is in a continual flux. There is no stasis in Bergson. Let me give you a quick quote. Duration means invention, the creation of new forms, the continual elaboration of the absolutely new. And that's from Creative Evolution. And it's a nice quote for this section, because it leads me into 4 points that I want to make. First, all change is creation of something new. And that follows from the fact that every moment, every current, every present includes the whole of the past behind it. So that's this idea of all moments interpenetrating each other into an organic whole, right? It means that every moment is brand new simply because it's this moment plus everything that came before it, and it's a continual pushing into the new. So even if this moment has happened before, right, everything is identical, but because this moment, it's not the first time, because it's happened before in the past, it's not the same. Just that is enough to make this moment different from the last moment, or from this state of affairs, different from the prior time that this same state of affairs occurred. Because this state of affairs includes that prior identical state of affairs. So whenever you factor in the past into the present in the way that Bergson does here, every change is the creation of something new. It leads into something new. And this means that change is fundamentally unpredictable. To predict something involves projecting what has already been seen, or inferring something based on what has already been seen. But if each moment is new, if each moment is brand new, a genuinely new creation, in the way that we're suggesting here, prediction is impossible. And that again, it's a more central element in creative evolution, and we'll talk about it later in relation to that book. But for now, that's something to just kind of bear in mind. All change is the creation of something new. That means that whatever occurs, all change is fundamentally unpredictable. And we think, though, about things like abstracted physical systems. So things that, systems that we take out of the whole and isolate by themselves. Those kinds of systems don't endure. They don't undergo duration, if you like. So those abstracted systems, then there is, since there's no duration going on there, it's possible for them to enter the same state twice. So if the same state occurs, it's not different from a prior state. We can treat it as identical. And in fact, it is identical because there's no duration, because it's been abstracted out from the whole. So there's only duration if you have that prior build-up of the past with you. If we take something out, stick it there on its own, isolated, then it doesn't endure, then we can predict future states. There's nothing unpredictable about that because there's no duration going on. And the example that Bergson gives is the system cup, kettle, and water. So you got those three things. Those are elements that we've broken, we've pulled out from the whole, from the natural world, into the static artificial system, this static artificial grouping. And now there's no duration, there's no past essentially. If the water in the kettle boiled at 100 degrees Celsius yesterday, then I can reasonably expect it will do so today, and that's fully predictable. We can predict that without any problems. As opposed to something like a psychic state, which is always part of a human, an individual, a whole, an organic totality. Those can never be predicted. And this is going to be a core part of his argument for freedom, which we'll look at a little bit later. The last thing I wanted to say that follows on from that quote, duration means invention, the creation of new forms, the continual elaboration of the absolutely new, is that it also means changes are irreversible. So you can never undo something, go back to a prior state. If you try and go back to a prior state, everything, even though everything is identical to some earlier state, again, just the fact that this state has happened before makes this state different. So whatever change takes place, because it's, and this is really saying the same thing as what I said in the second point, in the first point actually, all change is creation of something new. So you can never undo a change, go back to a prior state. And the way I've expressed this is that every moment is always experienced for the first time. So there's never any, creation is absolutely new. Change is, or better, change is absolute creation, the creation of the absolutely new. And that's change, creation, and becoming. Just a little bit. Like I say, we'll talk more about it in the context of creative evolution. But for now, let's head to a summary. Okay, so we talked about space first. We had the perception of extensity, and this is that heterogeneous lived space that we occupy, that we orient ourselves in, as opposed to the conception of space, which was an abstract, homogeneous background, which lets us juxtapose things, which gives us a static, unmoving, fixed kind of space in which to analyze, in which to measure, in which to count, in which to do all of those things that the intellect likes to do. Then we looked at duration itself. I talked about duration as being succession and mutual penetration. So those are really the two key ideas of duration. We looked at duration as a continuous progress of the past which gnaws into the future. That was another definition. And finally, some consequences of duration in the form of change or creation or becoming. and some of the points that I made here, every state is constantly changing. So the state itself is constantly undergoing change. And this is, we're talking about psychic states here. Change is genuine creation. So it's the creation of the absolutely new. Change is unpredictable. Therefore, we can never, and again, within psychic states or within any state that is enduring, the change that happens is unpredictable fundamentally. And finally, change is irreversible. Every moment is always experienced for the first time. And that is the first video on duration. We'll continue this theme in the next video. But yeah, I really like this concept, duration. It's a really nice, and it's just so novel. It's just so, there are bits and pieces of it in other places, but I'm not sure, maybe prior to Bergson there was someone who had something very similar, but certainly from the philosophers that I've read, this is so unique. And because it's just kind of, he's been pushed aside, Bergson, duration's just kind of languished there. No one's done anything with it for 100 years. So we're the first to get into it, maybe. Anyway, that's duration. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you in the next video.